Welcome to the very first episode of our brand new podcast, The Navigator. My name is Lucien von Schomberg, Senior Lecturer in Creativity and Innovation at the Business School, and I have the pleasure of hosting this episode today. But thankfully, I am not alone, and for the viewers out there, you can see I'm not alone, but I'm joined by an incredible lineup of guests. I would like to welcome, first of all, on my right side, Jane Harrington, Vice-Chancellor of our beautiful university, the University of Greenwich. Next to Jane, we have Carl Thomas, Enterprise Advisor and founder of Audio Wings. So welcome to both of you. And then on my left side, I have Gillian Boddington, Professor in Digital Immersion, as well as Neil Saunders, Senior Lecturer in Mathematical Sciences. So welcome to all of you. Really happy to have you and to start this episode off together. And I would like to start actually this episode. I mean, I've prepared questions for all of you, special questions, provocative questions to each and one of you. But before we dive into those, allow me to break the ice by raising a question I borrow from Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel, who asks, would life be better if AI did all the work? Would life be better if artificial intelligence did all the work?
What a question. I'm sure a lot of people will say yes, but I think it depends on how you define work personally. There's so many people that get so much purpose out of what they define as work. And if AI just replaces that, then where does that purpose come from? I don't know what the rest of you feel about that. Or...
Yeah, I share that view. And I think it is about that definition. It's also about actually what do we as humans actually really need in our lives. And actually lots of the research would say we need structure, and actually we need some form of routine, and without that actually our mental health can really suffer. So my own view would be that actually yes, routine jobs, repetitive jobs, absolutely, but should we replace everything? And I don't think we ever would. I think we still are critical beings that want to think and work out solutions, and whether we call that work or whether we call that leisure, and there's a difference for me between what's paid and not paid, and I just think we'll need to redefine that. But actually, we're always going to need some form of structure. Would be my view.
Well, two beautiful answers, Neil. I feel like you're.
There are many categories of work. I would be very happy if AI could wash my socks and and so on, do those sort of things that take us away from things. But the question came from a philosopher, and we have to remember what Aristotle said about work and leisure. He makes a distinction between our working life and our leisure life. We're gathered here in a university. He makes the idea that education is to make a noble use of your leisure. What an interesting thought that is. Yeah. And that takes work. So even living a life that is flourishing, that's full of good relationships, fulfilling leisure activities, that takes work. And that's a very human thing. And we want that to be a human conversation and a thing that's discussed between humans.
I think there's a very doomsday outlook around what AI can do and how it's going to just take over so many industries and disrupt so many industries. But I think what's actually quite interesting is that, some of the big technology companies that are starting to take AI out into the mainstream, they've already kind of assumed that a lot of people will think about how it will impact them and what they do in their careers. And I know Sam Altman, he's already done some research around universal basic income and the benefits of that in a world where AI just takes over everything. And when you look at some of the summaries of that research and those reports, it suggests that actually there's a lot of people who, when on universal basic income, actually would prefer to go out and have a purpose, have work and do something which, again, as you said, Jane, is more routinal for them. So I think it's probably a bit of a simplistic question to suggest that AI will just overcome or take over work in that sense. But at the same time, it's good to think that there are people who are a lot more learned than I am who are already studying that and already researching the benefits of having something that can complement and almost overcome the fact that there may be a loss if no one's working, so to speak.
But I do feel, though, there is certain parts of our work and our whole social work lives that an AI companion or a co-pilot could definitely help me with on a daily basis. And I was thinking about this, that, when you've got those translating, the possibility to translate those multiple to-dos that go through your head when you're folding the washing, or when you're brushing your teeth or in the shower, but you can't write down then, or you can't, go, oh, I mustn't forget that one, Actually, I'd love that just be added to my list, and I'd love to be able to just get things that I want to think searched about immediately, you know, and followed through to help translate those into direct actions. And a lot of, I think, down to earth things, just like scheduling and time management and nudging you to remember and pointing out errors and stuff. So, but it would need to learn with us and in fact reflect our own ways of thinking and our learning styles through that learning and take action. I'm slightly dyslexic, so I know that there's a debate on the table too about how this kind of AI companion can really help people with neurodiversity issues as well.
That's very apt, yeah.
I think this is something we'll come back to in many of the questions that will come up, but I think the overarching theme or goal for AI is that it enhances human productivity, human creativity. It allows for that sort of thing. It's never a replacement of and should never be designed or thought of as something that humans should be doing.
Is that something we would all agree with?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because I think the way it's been sort of scaremongered out in the popular press is that we'll all be sort of lying there as, you know, beings that have nothing to do at all, whereas actually that's far from the truth. And I think that point you make is very important.
And it relates also back to your first point where you mentioned sort of the distinction between, let's say, work in a very general sense and work strictly related to purpose as well. So work as a sort of fulfilling of purpose, as opposed to maybe washing your socks, which could be considered also as work, but it is fulfilling a purpose. Yes, maybe not in an existential sense. Yes. Maybe for some it does. So that's also, I guess, a discussion we could have. And in terms of philosophers, you mentioned Aristotle. There's also another one. My intellectual crush is Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher, and she also distinguishes between labor and work, where you could consider maybe some of these activities that are needed to survive, that we just need to do, can be labor. Maybe that's something where we could welcome AI. And then, of course, there's work, and she also talks about action. To what extent should AI take those roles over? Which brings us to the last point of creativity. Is AI something that could replace creativity, can think for us, can it take actions for us? Where I feel there's a common ground here.
And that is very clear, though, with Yuval Noah Harari. He's very clear about the fact that there's the biggest difference of AI to everything else that's happened before is that it is and will be even more be able to take its own decisions autonomously, and it is and will be even more creative. And we haven't had another tool alongside us in terms of our human condition that has those two very clear points. So that's where the potential danger zone comes in, and that's partly why the freak out's happening at this moment. But then we'll talk more about that, I'm sure.
Yes, and actually on that note, maybe now that we are all warmed up, and hopefully the listeners are warmed up as well, for maybe an even deeper debate about AI and artificial intelligence. And I want to ask you in first instance, Neil, but others are of course free to pitch in as well. Do you think that AI, artificial intelligence, will surpass HI, that is human intelligence, at some point? And in asking that, of course, I'm also asking, well, what exactly is AI? How does it differ from things like generative AI? Now we are all acquainted with ChatGPT and so on. And then ultimately, how does it differ from HI, human intelligence?
Sure. Well, I think we started with the philosophical realm. I think defining our terms is huge, and there's no real agreed definition on, artificial intelligence. In a way, it's a kind of misnomer for what the original founders of AI had. But I won't do this for very long, but if you sort of picture AI as a big circle like this that's been around for a long time, inside that circle is machine learning, which is more recent than AI, and inside that circle again, if you like, is deep learning. And one of the reasons why we're talking about this so much is that deep learning has just exploded in the last 15, 20 years for mainly just two reasons. One is the ebullition of data that is just needed to run these systems and the computational power. So all of a sudden these algorithms, the science that's been around in the dark AI winters where no progress was seeming to be made, now finds itself a natural home and we can really see what it's going to do. And the reason why we're having this discussion is because something that Descartes said in his discourses when asked whether an automaton could be conscious or whether it could actually understand things, he basically said, look, just have a conversation with it. Have a conversation, and then you'll determine whether something's conscious, understanding, sentient. And of course now we can have a conversation with GPTs and Bard and so on. But that doesn't for a moment imply that it understands a single thing, a word, a sentence that it generates. And that speaks to our natural inclination to anthropomorphize everything. We're on a hairpin trigger to interpret anything that might be human as human. And if it produces the goods, like recognises your faces or your relatives and so on, we can't help but think, it understands the way I do. And that's a big mistake. If you think about large language models simply as being a scaled-up version of predicting the next letter or next word in your emails or messages, that's all it naturally is. And it's wonderful, wonderful mathematics, beautiful statistics, but there's no comprehension, there's no thinking, reflecting, evaluating, judging, all the things that make us human. When Deep Blue, the chess program, beat Garry Kasparov in 1997, no one for a moment thought Deep Blue was conscious, sentient, understood it. It was just a computer. But now we've got the ELIZA effect ramped up, tenfold or a millionfold with these large language models. I think the main difference between artificial intelligence, large language models, and us is the way we use language. There's lots of research on this, but essentially the idea is language is a system of thought, primarily, not one for communication. Of course we use it for communication, but if you think about the proximate use of language, it's for thinking. It's for thinking, reflecting, judging, evaluating, having conversations with yourself. We do this all the time. Large language models, AI doesn't do any of this, even though it looks like it's doing that. So the idea that it's going to overtake human intelligence, I think we're a long, long way from anything that's ever approximating human intelligence in that sense. It's fantastic at mimicking it, but the fundamental insight of Alan Turing was a computer doesn't need to understand an algorithm in order to run it. Right?
Okay.
A large language model does not need to understand language in order to do language. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. And that's a distinction we really need to make.
That's actually, it reminds me, there's actually two lines that this reminds me of. One is from another philosopher, Wittgenstein, who says, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Lovely. And I guess in that context...
Yes, yeah. Forster also said, how do I know what I think until I can see what I say? Lovely. How do I know what I think until I see what I say?
And in that sense, you could say that if we follow your line of thinking, that AI, in the fact or in the idea that it just does language but doesn't really understand the language, in that sense it is also limited in really understanding the world. Yeah,
and that's not to diminish the wonderful thing that it is. It's great that it can actually do this. That's the real miracle, if you like, or that's the real benefit of it. But it is important on the same time that we don't say, it must understand things better than we do, because there's no understanding, there's no critical reflection. There's a phrase that, we're talking about philosophers all the time, but Dan Dennett has this wonderful phrase on biological evolution, which is competence without comprehension. And most of biological evolution is that particular thing. A species is competent in able to survive, reproduce, etc. It doesn't need to understand anything about its environment, its other species. It just needs to be competent. AI is fabulously competent, but the comprehension is still a long, long way away, and it's important that that's understood.
I do think, however, that with generative AI, which is what we're dealing with at the moment with ChatGPTs and all these different, whether they're text to text or image, or whether they're now image shifting, we've got some very clear long-term shifts coming up in that area. And I've seen some experiments recently where we're looking 10 years ahead here, and we definitely need to put on the table now the digital divide, considering how many people aren't even on the internet yet in many places of the world, because this is highly exclusive stuff that at the top end of it and at the future end of it. So, but there are now systems where you can do thinking of a whole series of ideas, images, etc., through MRI scans, through AI, into generating those as films or as text or whatever. So the ultimate thing of, it's not there yet, but the brain implant side, actually just literally you thinking and the AI generating from that thought, those thoughts into various different mediums, is on the table and is on its way, I'll repeat again, for very few people in the world probably, but it is, and it will be very expensive for a long time. But AI has those potentials to take us, a generative AI working with us. So, and then if we look at the potentials of autonomy and creativity in its own right, questionable, yeah. Then we've got a lot more speculative stuff to come out there in terms of how we deal with it. So a lot of this is the psychology of how we as humans deal with not something that's maybe more intelligent than us, but actually is literally able to work alongside us or integrated with us to produce into the world.
I think you make two really important points there, because I think in terms of how people envisage generative AI right now, you're right, a lot of people do think about, okay, it's a text input and then it gives me an output which could be video, audio, or just text again. But at the same time, there are already a number of different wearable companies, mine is one of them, whereby we're looking at biometric data and then using that data to start to develop some form of plan around how you would maybe maintain your health or become fitter, etc. So there's a number of examples of where generative AI, or at least a form of machine learning, is still using as an input something which isn't text and then giving an output something which is obviously very relevant to that individual. But you make a really important point about inclusivity and accessibility. There's a statistic which came out of, I think it's a survey conducted by Salesforce, and they basically said that currently 70% of Gen Z have used a generative AI platform, of which obviously ChatGPT over-indexes as the most popular. But at the same time, 68% of I'm going to get my terms wrong, but Gen X and boomers have no idea what generative AI is and what it can do for them. So already just in that small context, there's a massive divide in terms of who's using these tools and the power that has for them.
And I think many people who will use them and gradually are using them, and probably lots of people have had quite fun this summer working on ChatGPT and doing absolutely, people putting in, write a love letter to my partner, all these wild things. Seemingly and will continue to be utterly unaware about how it works in the back end of it.
Which isn't the worst thing in the world. I think there's definitely a discussion we could have around ethics, around how much data these large language models are actually consuming and what is actually intimate to us. But you're right, I think there's always going to be with technology, with latest technologies, etc. There's always going to be an abstraction between what it does and how it does what it does and who understands how it does what it does. And again, when it comes back to entrepreneurship, especially looking at it through the lens of what we do here at the university, there's a lot of student entrepreneurs who use so many different innovative technologies that have no idea about how it works, but just has a massive impact on what they want to do, which is not the worst thing in the world. So I take your point, but I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing that we don't know how it works at the moment.
Well, maybe we'll come more to that later, but I think there's a heck of a lot of ethics behind the grabbing of personal data, and the harvesting of that, and the creation of wealth for others through our own personal data. But I will talk about that a bit later as well.
Yes, I think
the ethics are very big.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, the ethics of artificial intelligence, I think that would be an episode on its own almost, but we
probably need to touch on it, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. So we will be delving into that. Maybe just to go back to the initial question about the difference between, AI and HI. I thought there was a line that you also shared that you stated before this recording, which is that artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligent.
Yes.
So I think that also kind of summarizes a lot of the points we've made here.
I think someone described it as just statistics on steroids. Easy for me to say. But
I think that's
if you think of it like
definition.
that, that's more close. That's more closely aligned with what it's actually doing.
Yeah, and of course we talk about AI, HI, human intelligence. That's also a question: what actually is human intelligence? And this is where I want to move to you, Guylaine, in terms of the identity, the self, the human identity, and how AI, and maybe also the evolution of technology more broadly, affects the self, our personal identity, and what does the future of the self look like?
Okay, so yes, this is an area I've been working on for a very long time. I'm coming from a dance background, so I'm very much someone who works with the living, breathing, sweating, moving body. And I've worked for the last 35 years looking at that living body and its relationship to our emerging technologies, both on the individual level, but also in a collective level in relationship to society and how that's shifting our understanding of self and selfhood and identity. And most of the technologies I work with, of course, are body interface technologies. So motion capture, telepresence, robotics, holograms, avatars, etc. And exploring those digital reflections of ourselves. And not just of ourselves, but of others. Yeah, how we deal with the other. So it links a lot into intercultural theory, actually, and the thinking around self and other, and how we judge or assume things around that. But here we're looking at the blending of virtual physical worlds, which we've all seen happen so much more massively across the last 5 years, really. I think COVID brought that really into focus because we were so locked down in our individual spaces, we couldn't do anything but do our virtual blending, and we've learned a lot more about that. So, but going back to AI, and our AI companion, I am at the moment starting a whole new set of work here at University of Greenwich, looking at a new project which I've called My AI Hybrid Biotwin. And this AI hybrid biotwin is probably a long way off. This is future speculative research, but I'm bringing together a whole load of work being done all over the world by experts from many sectors looking at digital human twin modelling. And it really is fascinating, actually, because they're coming from very different backgrounds through, obviously through the medical sector, but there's also the gaming sector, fitness and health apps, which Carl knows lots about, training apps, and of course all of them, the avatars that are supporting us through apps like mental health stuff, and the fashion avatars that let us try stuff on. And these experts I'm bringing together also looking at ethics and data and legal issues around that. So the amalgamation of that and what that will come through with, we've got a lot of quite big questions on the table here. You know, how long is it until I can have a digital self in this way? I'd like to have that digital self tethered from birth. I think ownership of our own personal data, my breath, my heartbeat, etc., is essential in that kind of concept. What will that make in changes to our behaviour? How do we start to have an emotional sense of our selfhood and our responsibility as selves in this world? And what happens to responsibility as self if actually you're owned by a corporate? Your digital self behaves badly, and you go, well, that wasn't me, was it? It was the Google digital me. I didn't know it did that to you, Carl. I didn't have any say on it. And also the ethics here, the protection that's needed, the protocols, possibly global standards, which I'm sure we'll get to start to talk about here. What happens if you're hacked? What happens if you're actually owned? But at the core of this, I believe, is personal data ownership. And you mentioned it, biometrics is the biggest harvested area of personal data in the last 10 years. 10 times the amount during COVID has been gathered through vaccination passports and tracing apps, etc. Your irises are all held in many data farms around the world, particularly if you're travelling, going through passports and stuff. We don't own ourselves, and many of those corporates make up to 95% of their income and their revenue stream from selling bits of us to each other, for behavioural and attitudinal market research.
That's also a problem actually that was already emerging, I would say, a while ago under the umbrella term of surveillance capitalism, where basically capitalism is now sort of, or the digitalization is becoming an extension of capitalism, where profit is being maximized out of your data, which is sort of the raw material now feeding into this new economic system, with, of course, a lot of ethical implications. I just wanted to ask, Ghislaine, just for clarification, when you talk about this project, you talk about digital twins. What is this? Is this twin then the extended self in the digital version? So, for example, you mentioned this Google version of you. Is this the so-called twin?
At this moment, Google might have 25 bits of me from doing, my iris, from doing passport, possibly VR and AR are very high collectors of biometric data. So are fitness and health apps, and mental health scenarios, so maybe Google owns 25 bits of the 1,000 bits of me that possibly, there's probably more than that biometrically, and maybe Amazon owns another bits of me and other, so at this point there's still not a possibility for them to converge and create, say, a digital army out of us, but that's not that far off if we continue to just be okay about just handing over our personal data into this surveillance capitalist scenario, but which has become one of the biggest wealth enhancing. It's why the gap's becoming bigger and bigger between billionaires and us, The figures range between $10,000 to $100,000 per person using digital around the world that they make on each of us annually. So it's a very, very wealthy area. But I'm looking at digital human twin modelling, and that very specifically is highly advanced in some medical sectors, in the space sector, in various areas which have gone really deeply into it. Ergonomics, crash car dummies are no longer dummies, they are avatars, that actually are tested. And in Formula One, these incredible body sensors that happen all over the body. Esports is a really good example, because that's coming into the living room, where actually people will sensor up, whether it's in helmets or in their hand things on the body, and they are physically in that game, and they're competing. Taekwondo, they're doing it really great with others who are in their own living rooms, but the competition is in that virtual world. So that hybridity between the live, the virtual, physical blending is absolutely happening for all of us, So, but it is really now, how we look at the extension of ourselves. And I do, somehow, something in me just feels that we should own that from birth. It would be very helpful to have our AI companion tethered from birth, representing us after death even, in our whole lives, learns with us and actually develops with us, learns our learning methods and processes, because it's so different for all of us and different cultures, different religious backgrounds, and actually can supplement us, support us, be there for us, advise us, not take autonomous decisions without us, no, except maybe if it's a weekly one, like paying the shopping bill, or, but you've allowed, you opt in to certain things, you've got your choices. And the data from that, data for good, very important, climate change, medical data, etc. For sure we can opt in that data. We can say, I'm completely fine about this set of my health data being used into that huge research globally into whatever particular area. Same with climate data, etc. These are really important aspects. So it doesn't cut out data for good. What it does is give us the choice to charge or earn our own money from it, or even possibly just to go, everything that you did earn from me, whatever big corporate platform, I'd prefer it to be redirected to this charity or to a place in the world where there's less data access. Please give them the money to have data or whatever. So,
That's interesting. I mean, I hear sort of the dark side of AI where you began, but then it ended up with a little bit of a careful optimism and sort of a bright side of AI as well, potentially.
None of this will happen without proper regulation. So I'm speculating conceptually what could happen positively. Could be a very positive thing, 30, 50 years ahead, in a world with a much less digital divide, But I'm speculating, and also that's why I've got ethicists involved and data rights people involved at the issues that are really coming at us much faster than that, actually.
There's a huge challenge in that, isn't there? Because, international law is notoriously difficult. And notoriously difficult to actually get people to actually follow and abide by. If you just think of digital wars, and how difficult that's become. I think you're right, but my concern in that is, how do you actually regulate? And how do you regulate across the world in an even sense?
I share that, because ultimately what we're having to do now is ask these big tech, behemoths to be almost self-policing. And ultimately we know that their their goal is to obviously generate as much revenue as possible from ourselves or whatever products and services they have. But I think one of the implied assumptions is that when we are using these companies, we assume that they know what they're collecting and also why they're collecting it. But that is not always the case. So I run a wearable technology company that runs events on a regular basis to understand some of the pertinent insights around wearable technology. We've been doing this for about 6-7 years now, and one of the very first speakers that we had, or in fact I say speakers, one of the guests that we had was the chief data architect from Jawbone, who creates smart bands very similar to Fitbit. And this was going back to around 2013-14. So one of the things that he was talking about was the fact that they collect a lot of data around motion of hands and obviously motion itself. But from their perspective, they didn't know what to do with this data, because they're not a health company, they're just a consumer electronics company. And the one thing that really terrified me and also fascinated me was the fact that they could understand so much about what someone was doing at that moment in time just based on their hand movements, to the extent extent whereby they were mandated by some state in the US to do a sleep study. But at the same time, what they realized was that they could determine how often people were going to the toilet based on their hand movements and based on their body movements. Now, from that perspective...
Might remove this now.
Well, hopefully this doesn't influence that too much, right?
Yeah.
But from that perspective, because they're not a health company, they're just a consumer electronics company, they've got this data. What do they do with it?
They can't just sell it.
Well,
because for most of the larger platforms working in immersive world development, even with Meta, etc., it's basically the angle of your head and the gesture of your
Absolutely.
hands. They can make the entire avatar of you and your movement.
Yeah.
And the reason it's needed is for behavioural and attitudinal marketing, so that they know what your behaviours are like, how you tend to behave, what your attitudes are, and therefore what to make for you, to push at you and sell.
And to bring it one level further, because this is about that they're able to predict your behavior, but even more problematic is that they can manipulate your behavior. There's often been cases where they can steer your behavior into a certain direction that you never intended to go to. So
power of AI with that data that's enabling this.
And even get more dystopian. I mean, going back off of what you said, if they can create a digital twin without your knowledge, that replicates and mimics your actions, and then, I don't know, I don't want to get too kind of out there, but does things that almost give you a bad representation or reputation.
Well,
it's challenging.
It's in discussion in many places, and one could go in the direst way. Go, oh my gosh, they might use the digital human twins of every person who works and is a student at Greenwich to make a little army, which they're going to fight against University College London's little digital twin army, and you know what I mean. It's like you can go wild on it,
True.
But I think it actually what it boils down to is where we started. This is how do we get to any kind of global regulation, like Jane said. I mean, look at nuclear arms. We haven't even got that sorted yet. How do we do that with governments and tech companies working together? But also, I think this again is Yuval Noah Harari is, basically this is linked to thou wilt not steal. Yeah, and he's very clear on the fact there's got to be this stop of stealing that's happening, and harvesting and stealing, or one could put it down to greed. Yeah, so actually, what do we want the world to be like? And most business and corporates at the moment are saying there's got to be a stop, a slowdown on all this till we found out a lot more about where it's going, what's happening. But actually, does greed override that?
that's a beautiful question. And of course, now we're talking about sort of the implications of all of this in the broad sense for society. I also want to delve a little bit deeper into the implications of artificial intelligence for higher education. And that's where I would like to pose my question to you. And if you allow me to ask you a provocative question, will AI make higher education obsolete? And in that context, what do you think is the biggest challenge, perhaps opportunity, of AI for higher education?
I mean, I think it's a fascinating debate, because actually I think it is a bit like how do we define work? How do we define higher education? If we define it as the institutions and the sort of buildings we have now, then I suspect they won't exist. 50 years' time, I doubt you'll see all the same institutions you would see now. However, if you define it as a place of learning, a place of development, a place where people come together to develop knowledge and understanding, I still believe that will exist. I think it'll exist in multiple ways. Would we be interacting with Jelane's digital self or her real self around that? Probably both, And so for me, I still think institutions of learning will exist. And I still think we'll have that, because we will never get to a point, I don't believe, in the world where we're so knowledgeable we've answered every single wicked problem. I think that'll still exist. But I think that in the short term, there's real questions for me about actually, if we can actually generate material that's really actually provides us with a student with the basics of what they need, would we not be better deploying ourselves to do different things, to actually help people to understand and learn and develop, rather than spend hours developing year one materials? So I think there's some things we need to really ask ourselves, some hard questions. I asked GBT, by the way, what they thought was the biggest challenge or opportunity for higher education. And they said that the biggest challenge for AI in higher education is ensuring ethical and unbiased use, Protecting student privacy and addressing concerns about job displacements due to automation. The opportunity lies in enhancing personalised learning, improving educational access and advancing research through AI-driven insights and automation of administrative tasks. Balancing these challenges and opportunities will be crucial for the future of education and beyond. Not a bad answer, actually, to be fair. Yeah, I thought that wasn't bad. Actually, the bit that I think is really interesting, though, for me, in terms of opportunities, is actually that whole piece around personalised learning. Yeah. I mean, you started to touch upon it, when you were talking about actually being dyslexic, and also the whole business around people who are dyspraxic and dyslexic who come into education and really struggle. I think actually AI can be incredibly helpful for them. We have students who come in who haven't got those social networks, who come in here, and actually we could be providing them with very different types of personalised support. We could be using AI to help with formative assessment so that people gain confidence. So for me, if we can harness it in a really positive way, it could be fantastic. I could see it transforming some of our students, transforming the way that they actually understand and learn. And actually, would I ever want people to be doing rote learning? Well, no, I don't now. So, but this absolutely puts that, in the box of we won't be doing that, because why would you do it? Why do I need to learn some dates when actually I can get that anywhere? And if I'm in the workplace, I won't be going, gosh, I can't remember that. What do I do? I'll Google it, won't I? Or chat GPT or whatever. So for me, I think there's a whole piece around learning. There's a whole piece also about how we can help support students in different ways that could be really powerful. But then there is a massive challenge about data and the ethics and IP, and that for research is really important as well. And it comes back to the points you're making, Jane and Ghislaine, and I think there are some real issues about international regulations and how we manage that. And I think also we have a role in how we educate students, because if we genuinely want the young people to do what you've said, actually to harvest data for the good, not the bad, we want to actually really confront that whole issue of greed. That's our job, to help young people to understand that. Otherwise, I do think there'll be greater disparities. So I think we've got a job to do that. So that would be my starting point for 10.
It's been a really interesting last term to teach with particularly large language models coming out. But AI is being used in education for a while now. I actually use my iPad to teach quite a lot, and there's a fantastic AI technology that turns your handwritten mathematical into code, and that's being used. I did a shift presentation with two of my third year students who were on the neurodiverse spectrum on the benefits of this technology, and this is before the large language models came out. But I mean, we've been defining terms, haven't we? I mean, education, educare, comes from to bring forth the best, and in that sense, education is never going to stop, even with AI. It's been a real opportunity for me, at least, in the mathematical sciences and the more technical sciences, to say, great, hang on, but you still need to do the work yourself. You can go on to Google, which may be generatively giving you an answer back, but how are you going to sift through the information? How are you going to determine which is right or wrong, and how are you going to make that decision? Well, the answer is you still have to do the job of work, of understanding, reflecting, criticising. And with the large language models, I've been using ChatGPT in real time in front of the class and give it a question and say, you got it right this time. Now I'll just change the parameters slightly. It's got it wrong, but it's fantastically convincing when it's wrong. So now, what are you going to do? Now you have a huge responsibility to make sure that you know what's going on. If you're a nurse, you want to make sure you get the proportions of the doses right. You don't go to ChatGPT for it. You want to make sure that the responsibility is still with you. If you're making decisions that affect humans, you want humans to be ultimately responsible for that decision.
But if AI can look at your MRIs and your data and actually look much more effectively than you can yourself around whether you've got cancer than a human eye can do, actually I think that's fantastic.
There's two wonderful points there. So that sort of AI, I think we need to make a distinction. That sort of AI is not a large language model. No, that's exactly. A neural net trained on to do a very specific task. And at every point of the process, the people know the sort of question they're asking, they kind of know what the answer should look like, and they roughly know what the machine is actually doing. Inside a large language model, we don't. So I think the story that really caught my attention was the Acinetobacter baumannii, that horrible disease where they used AI to train up several thousands of molecules. It would have taken hundreds of thousands of human hours.
Yeah, exactly.
And now that the lead on that research project said, now we've narrowed it down to this, now the real work begins. And all of the learning, the rote learning, the drilling in the scientists was needed to take this project through to fruition. So nothing diminishes with the presence of AI. It's always an enhancer and a learner. And just a very final point on when AI is diagnosing things. There was a little study recently with the sort of trust and displacement of human capabilities in this, was that the nurses were just a little bit concerned about when they disagreed with the AI and whether they should go with the AI decision or their own decision. So yes, regulation, careful checks all the way down. Never a replacement, always an enhancer for what you're capable of.
And in that case, total personalisation, and definitely you must own your own body data from that. For any kind of deep medical debate or results that are coming through need to be between you and your doctor and the team. Yeah, that's a prime example actually of personal data ownership. Yes. But I do think there's one thing following on from what Jane was saying about actually learning, what learning is in the future. I do think there's a possibility here that with the support AI, the assistive AI, the one that can actually like bring together stuff for you to then critically analyse and do reflection on, or actually up the benchmark in a way, will we not possibly see a situation where a BA first year student actually comes in really at an MA level? It opens up a lot more space for original thinking and potentially for the evolution of much more interdisciplinary thinking too, because of the time that one has not to be focused specifically specialist. And maybe then we will find some ways to get to some solutions to real world problems, because we just don't have enough time and headspace.
But I think that's really interesting, because if you go back to someone like Max Weber, he was a polymath, wasn't he? Who looked at as many and was seen as an exception at the time, whereas actually today he wouldn't be. And I think we've already moved a long way. So what you're talking about is actually just the next level of that, and I think that would be true.
And helping that access that to many more people, and for students to understand it. And that is, I guess, one point that's really clear, and I'm sure we'd all agree on this, that pretty much, we shouldn't be letting students out the door of the university without at least a baseline understanding of AI, and that doesn't matter what discipline or what faculty they're in.
No, I agree.
It's part of life now, as well as their world of work onwards, and they need to understand the positives and the negatives and the ethical debate, etc. as well.
And that also comes back to your earlier point about actually how exclusive it is as well, because actually some of our students don't have access. So it's about how do we, for the starting point has to be giving them each of them access that will enable that.
Definitely.
So I would agree.
Some fantastic insights about the implications of AI for education. And again, I sense sort of a dark side to it as well as a bright side, which is beautiful to see. I also want to discuss this because of the fact we have an entrepreneur on the table. I want to discuss sort of the implications of AI also for entrepreneurship. And again, a similar provocative question, if you will. But would you say that AI disrupts the meaning of entrepreneurship? And also, how does entrepreneurship look like in a world that's increasingly AI dominated?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think first and foremost, I kind of bristle at the word or the use of the word disrupt, because when you look at how entrepreneurship has just evolved over the last kind of 15, 20 years that I've been an entrepreneur, there's been so many different technologies that have helped to both abstract and also democratize entrepreneurship so that more people have been able to, be more entrepreneurial. So I think AI is just another evolution of entrepreneurship. And when you look at how people are using it these days in SMEs and even big corporates, I think I read a study recently that was done by Salesforce, which basically said that HubSpot, 62% of their member base have already invested into different types of AI and automation tools. So it's already something which is prevalent. As I said, the cat's out the bag. But when you look at how they're using it, one of the biggest challenges that a number of entrepreneurs, small business owners are having right now, and I'm basically referencing data and discussions that we had at our recent SME Business Conference, they're having a challenge of how to engage with their customers, their potential customers. You know, right now there are so many different social platforms by which your potential customers exist on, and they're having discussions about you, your brand, and your products and services. So for an entrepreneur to basically be present in all these platforms and then monitor and engage with them on these platforms, it's a massive amount of labour, and also then it's a massive challenge to actually understand, analyse, and then start to, you know, feedback and create different processes and systems based on these engagement and these kind of discussions they're having. So for AI to be able to at least engage with them on these platforms and then analyse on their behalf and bring all of that data down into one source of truth so that an entrepreneur can understand what people are envisaging about their brand or talking about, you know, it's a massive benefit for them. And I think when we had this discussion at our most recent business conference, when people were looking at the benefit of AI in their specific workflow or even in their specific company, it was about optimizing and enhancing their productivity. It was about trying to make them more present so that they could overcome this, what HubSpot mentioned, this crisis of disconnection, so that they actually are being more present where the customers are. And you've got to remember as well, in this time that we live in, we're having a cost of living crisis. You know, costs are rising massively for a number of corporates. So from their perspective, the number one challenge that they have is making sure that they can start to get more customers or even maintain their customers to improve their revenue. And if AI can help them in that space, then it's a massive win for them. So yeah, I don't think it's a disruption of how people are being more entrepreneurial. I really think it's just an evolution of the things that people are doing to make sure that they are present with their customers. And I think also as well, when we look at it through the lens of what we do here in the Generator with regards to teaching entrepreneurship to young learners, already, as Neil mentioned, there are a lot of people who are using AI that are in this university, and they're using it in so many different ways. In fact, recently we had someone come who wanted a one-to-one session with us because they wanted to create a whole AI-based university. Luckily, I don't think it's going to put us out of a job anytime soon, but at the same time, it's fascinating to see how they're using AI in so many different applications. But predominantly what we do here within the Generator, we help people who are at the early stage of their entrepreneurial career understand how to test and validate ideas. And, when I was, first starting out being an entrepreneur, I had to replicate a whole data room by basically, commandeering my nan's attic and, creating servers and, modems that would actually act as a data room. Now, we don't need to do that because we have Amazon cloud-based services and, Azure and Google services to do all of that, all right? I used to go out on street corners with clipboards and ask people questions. We don't need to do that anymore. We can just jump on social media, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, and ask people directly questions. And with AI is doing so much of that heavy lifting for us now, whereby we don't need to, think about how to optimize a marketing or a sales funnel, or we don't need to think about the specific copy we put on an advert because AI can do that quite quickly, quite instantly. And it goes back to what you're saying, Neil. It gives us, and in fact also Jane, it gives us the ability to start to think about the optimal use of our time creatively, so that actually we're not having to be bogged down by all these menial tasks that we tend to have to do as entrepreneurs.
Yeah, so it's a sort of again AI as an enhancer.
Yeah, as a co-pilot, I guess a lot of people talk about this.
An enhancer, and you could also say maybe as a mediator. And this brings back to the point that I think Ghislaine mentioned earlier when you talked about, you want to tackle real life challenges, and sometimes real life challenges, they require different disciplines who speak different languages, which brings us again to the question of language. But maybe AI can help us mediate those different languages to tackle the same problem. And when you talk about the university of the future, I guess there's the AI-powered university, you could say. But I also know there are ongoing projects to create this university that goes beyond faculties or beyond disciplines, where you're basically focusing on grand challenges, and you tackle grand challenges where you could use AI maybe as a mediator to help that.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because we've tried for years to do that, and actually doing it as we're constructed now is really difficult. And to actually have AI help us do that might actually just bring people together. And half the problem is actually disciplines do use such different languages, as you say, and you can have a conversation that sort of goes like that, over, and it would be great to bring that together.
Yeah. So we actually did this a little bit of an experiment at the business school as well, where you have the SDGs, the 17 self-development goals from the United Nations. And then within our research group, we formed some interdisciplinary teams, and they just have to choose one of these objectives or goals, if you will, and then ask the chat to sort of help them mediate their different expertises to tackle this common challenge and see what comes out of it. And actually one of the groups continued and started developing a project around it. So it was really interesting to see sort of an illustrative way of how AI could potentially...
This all hints towards having more headspace and original thinking time and critical reflection time. And it is interesting, it just dawned on me that we've spent the last 20 years talking about the robotisation of humans, actually, production line sensors, which is using AI, of course, How many times did you actually move your hands like this in that day because you're meant to do it 2 times more than that, or you're going to lose your job or get told off or whatever, so the invasiveness of that social, the worker and the social scenario of it. But this actually, in a way, we're talking the other way. We're talking about the actually opening up of time. And I really agree with you, Carl, on the productivity and efficiency. I mean, many of those tools are starting to come in. We're going to, I think there's AI assistants coming into Zoom, into Slack, into Microsoft. They're really fast becoming available.
Yeah.
They won't be us, they will be very, an assistant for us, a companion, So, but I think there's still 2 things there which are really important, and for any SMEs, so small, middle-scale enterprises, the debate about data gathering, personal data gathering, data in general, is really on the table, particularly in anybody interfacing technology, which actually majority of technology is today, because it's taken a long time to get there, but finally the interface is the majority of the body. And that being a kind of decision for any small business at the start, what are they saying to their customers? Are they going to, and many of them now do say up front, on the front, we will be gathering your data, we will be holding it, that it will be anonymous, and we will synthetically take from it, and then we will delete it, And we promise you we will not be selling your data to other companies.
And we believe them, right?
Well, with the small ones you do, they're making a green product, or, they're genuinely, for the small founders and in the studio, they do mean it, they really do,
True.
Whether they can keep that up, because they get to the next stage and they're pitching for investment, and what the investors want is we'll give you a revenue stream for the next 4 years, but at the end of it, you will give us all the data you have collected from your customers. And this is a really big and that's big on the table debate. It's a big divide that still has to be bridged between the small, particularly the small enterprise, good outputs, health and well-being, climate change things, a lot of the wonderful ideas and solutions that the younger generations are coming up with in their entrepreneurship, and the big corporate platforms who, we go back to it, are, it's maybe power and greed, and keeping at the top of the rich list or whatever. So
it is an important thing because the societies and democracies could be in the decisions that affect them, could be in the hands of privately owned for-profit organisations for whom breaking the law doesn't mean that much. And this is something to. I think at all of this, there's always choices to be made. You have a choice as to how much data you want to give. Seneca said time was the thing that you gave away most freely. Well, now it's data the things you give away most freely, and we do have to be conscious of it. It's not just your personal data, but to store the data has a massive carbon footprint. To train a large language model, Emma Struble wrote a paper, there's something like 120 round-trip flights from London to Beijing to train up the ChatGPT. Now, we talk about existential risk of AI. There's an existential risk of climate change that is very, very real and is very urgent. We need to have a discussion about whether we want these sort of technologies and be educating the next generation entrepreneurs, leaders, students, citizens on these very topics.
And one of the issues we've got is there are not enough people with the knowledge you've just talked about to educate. And so it's how do we actually get that, really bring people up to speed? Because we can't do it unless we've got people who can help do it, if that makes sense.
Let me know when you need me.
I do. I've already clocked that one, Neil.
How green is your data debate? And then it's another one of those kind of ethical, moral considerations for every small enterprise starting
Absolutely.
out. And I know the university's been approaching it. I've been with Simon Goldsmith. He's done a lot of work on actually looking at how the data here is stored and getting it better and better in relationship to green credentials. And you're absolutely right, Neil. I mean, the data farms, I think, at the moment all over the world, which are massive, and mainly underground and near the Arctic and stuff, because they give out so much heat, are the equivalent climate change issue to all of lights in the world. So some of them are doing circular economy things where the heat from the farm will heat the local town, etc., but not enough, There could be a lot more of that done. Some of them are thinking more sustainability and trying to be a bit more responsible about these things, but many of them aren't.
Which comes back to your first point, doesn't it, about international regulation?
Yes.
In a way, we've returned back to that.
Yeah.
And on the topic of regulation as well, I know the EU or the European Commission now proposed certain laws where, for example, they say that big tech or any company cannot use AI and data collection to neither predict nor manipulate behavior. Well, first of all, that law needs to be signed by all member states, so that brings us back to the sort of the practical issue around regulation. But also, if that were to really be signed, then a lot of the practices that big tech are currently doing would not be allowed.
Okay, how would they implement that?
That seems like a law that would be more honoured in the breach than...
Exactly.
Exactly.
The discussion really is the governments and corporates have to work together. We can't, you're right, Neil, it cannot just be the corporates that make these decisions. And also we know governments haven't managed to get these things sorted even on nuclear or whatever. But so ultimately we are at this very weird tipping point where there has to be some kind of moral engagement at a correct level between governments and corporates. Now, how many of us trust either side? I don't know. It depends what country you live in, doesn't it, as well? It's like how your government's going to behave, or, even if your government changes, But the feeling that's coming from the bigger talkers on this is definitely we do need some more global institutions now, and the ability to bring in some kind of restrictions, but also retaliations, I guess, or fines, but which are meaningful, which aren't just like 20 million. Google, I mean, it's nothing for Google. It's like...
Parking fine.
Yeah.
I hate to cool off what is a really interesting and deep discussion that we had so far. I want to sort of close our episode with a lighter thought experiment, if you will, again borrowed from Michael Sandel. And I want all of you, including the listeners, to imagine the not so near future, maybe the near future, marriage prediction app, AI-powered marriage prediction app, where you download the app and you no longer need to swipe, as you all need to do now on the current dating apps. You don't need to swipe because you are automatically matched with your ideal partner. The idea is the app knows you better than you know yourself and will be able to match you with the perfect partner. So you download the app. The only condition that you have for downloading this app is that you indeed have to marry this person.
Well, who's to say that we're not with our already ideal partners, right? I hope my missus isn't watching this, but...
Maybe this app would bring you with your missus after all, so that would be a confirmation. But the question, of course, is, would you download this app? Maybe first a yes or no. Neil?
No.
No.
Maybe. I think I'd download it out of curiosity.
Yes. To follow it, though.
If I wasn't with my partner, yes. I mean, if I'd download it out of curiosity, maybe not, have to follow it, I'm not sure. But I'd definitely be curious to understand how it works. And I like to think of myself as someone who downloads things just to see how they work anyway. So out of curiosity, I'd definitely look to play with it.
So careful, yes.
Yes, very careful, yes.
If I had to marry who was on the app, absolutely categorically no. If I didn't, yes, because I'm nosy and I'd like to see what it said.
The curiosity.
Yeah.
Surely if there's a marriage prediction app, there's a divorce prediction app. And a prediction app for the rival
Any of
company.
us that are married like me as well, we'd have to use that, wouldn't we? But I think for me, I wouldn't do it because there's two reasons. One is, and back to it, you're going to have to reveal a massive amount of personal information and not just your biometrics, like, it's going to ask my height and my bust size and everything else, but actually much more personal stuff around my history, my dreams, my mental states, behaviours, etc.
Yeah.
But two, I think we've got to go back to something Neil said at the beginning. You know, this is not sentient, yeah. This is not conscious, yeah. We're talking to bots, yeah, and bots are not free thinking, yeah. So all they're doing is gathering multiple different views from thousands and billions of different places. So it's, I think, hugely reductive, and brings us to a point of, again, being in the danger of seeing AI as a she or a he or a they, anthropomorphizing it, rather than realizing it's an it. Yeah, it's a tool. It's a tool for us to support us. It's not something to be led by into marriage. Yeah.
The challenge is, I mean, there's already a number of different AI-based avatar platforms out there that are, you know, trying to simulate the role of a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a partner in a relationship. I saw a story recently about someone who I think committed suicide because his avatar that he had actually had a relationship with over a period of time went offline for a couple of days, and he just didn't know how to cope. He didn't know, he didn't have anyone to, you know, interact with. So,
and who's responsible?
Exactly.
Who's responsible? That's an important point. I think in all of this, you mentioned, I loved your phrase you mentioned before, crisis of disconnection. And just, well, social media was meant to bring us together, wasn't it? And the report card is mixed on there. And I think in all these discussions is to say to everyone, young people, people our own age, our peers, it's to say, look, you are more than your data. What you do it in reality. What they do it meta.
I love that.
A personality is not something intrinsic. It comes from interactions between people. Your mind and your brain, your mind is a product of interaction with brains. And it's the whole point about all of this is that we want to enhance the flourishing relationships between humans, which is the important part. And if that strays, then we start to get into a little bit of trouble. The most powerful AI, the most powerful computer still is the organic matter between your ears. And it's still a muscle, and it's use it or lose it. And we still have to use it very well.
Also, I think, when I think about my own partner, who I've been with for 34 years, I should say we're not married, but when I think of that, I'm quite convinced an AI tool would never have picked him for me. And therefore I sort of think, what would be the point, you know? Because actually it's the point you're making, there's much more to it. I also think the point you're making about actually who's responsible, if you look at some of the sort of social media stuff that actually is encouraged, for example, eating disorders, online bullying, you know, and that really worries me, actually, that actually sucks young people in, and suddenly they're not responsible. They behave as if that online presence is more real than they are, and then you see some terrible outcomes of that. So I think there's a really serious point to that.
What a tremendous waste of potential.
Yeah, exactly.
What an opportunity missed. And we don't want to go down there.
No.
We might see, and this is still very in discussion, particularly in the computer science sector, AIs that start to become kind of police AIs or regulating AIs that actually are checking other AIs, and looking for malicious behaviour, disinformation, bad behaviour. Like, you're right, the girlfriend stuff is huge. Dream girlfriend, there's thousands of them out there. And what it's doing, of course, in some cases maybe it's positive, others like your story, it's negative, but what it's still doing is objectifying women into being just a, you know, an avatar, which, you know, which you can choose how big this bit is, that bit is, how many times a day you want a beautiful text sent to you to make you feel great, you know. So, but there may well be a development of an AI punishing system within itself, or something. I mean, I've been in a great discussion where Luca Vigano, a professor at King's College, he compares all of the cybersecurity stuff and AIs to various fairy tales throughout time. It's fascinating, actually. Cinderella's slipper, you know, that's an absolute key pass only if it's her digital identifier. Open Sesame is a password thing. It's a great lecture, actually, really great. And he talks about Pinocchio, and Pinocchio was, you know, a block of wood that had intelligence that the carpenter made into a human anthropomorphic form and became this fairy tale. And as I was talking to him, I said, but Pinocchio, when he lied, his nose grew. And he's like, that's it, that's what's got to happen. This is like, how do we get AIs to, when they're lying, when their disinformation is coming through, when they're being malicious, but something shows that is picked up by other AIs, and actually something comes in to stop that or to catch it. And deep fakes, for example, with watermarking on them, there's a lot more ideas coming on, and we'll see a rapid development in that across the next 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
It's funny because I'm just thinking about it now. So a lot of people use AI, especially ChatGPT, to write copy. And there's already different AI services that are looking to detect ChatGPT written copy. So I can absolutely see how that regulating or that self-regulating policy is already coming into play, which is fascinating to think about it. But then who regulates the regulators? So you still have this challenge of regulation somehow, right?
That's where we need, unfortunately, more institutions in the world, but some that actually do have some kind of clout. Yeah. So maybe.
And on a maybe, I would like to thank you all. So I would really like to thank, well, in first instance, our guests for sharing your expertise, for having the time to come here, and your insights into AI and beyond. So thank you, Jane, Carl, Ghislaine, and Neil for being here, for launching this first episode with me. And of course, also thank you to our listeners, our new listeners, our first listeners, for joining us today on The Navigator. You are the compass that guides us in this new podcasting adventure, and we're excited to have you part of this interdisciplinary community. So keep navigating, keep exploring, and keep listening to The Navigator. Cut!